Welcome to the 38th Real Business of Wine sessions. And tonight we are delighted to have one of the legends of wine communication, Karen MacNeil, whose Wine Bible, you can see behind me, is the biggest selling wine book in the United States. And it is, if anybody has seen the recent Netflix movie Uncorked, it is the only book, it seems, that you really need to get yourself through all of the MS exams and everything else. And whether or not that's the case, it was great to see it there as being the handbook for the people who are working their way up that ladder. So Karen is in Napa, am I right, Karen?
Right in the heart of the Napa Valley. It's a beautiful day today.
And we're going to be talking about that book, that's the second edition, and there's a third edition being worked on, I think, at the moment. But I think I'm very interested, and certainly Polly and I are very interested in some of the other aspects of Karen MacNeil, because you've done quite a lot of stuff early on online. You were one of the pioneers online, and then into video, PBS, and some of the stuff you're now doing. The idea of people tasting with you, and I think that sort of ties into a lot of the virtual tasting things that are happening. And also, and I think we'd love to look at this as well, the fact that you are, I will say the word unashamedly, you are a commercial entity. If I go to your website, you offer yourself and your services in terms of helping people with marketing and so on, which is exactly what Polly and I do. So we're all in the same sort of world, but it's a different world to the one that maybe some other wine writers, book writers, and so on might possibly place themselves in. So it'd be quite interesting to examine that. But can we go back to the MacNeil, well, your family when you were growing up? That wasn't a wine drinking family, was it? Or was it?
No, definitely not. I don't think either of my parents ever had a sip of wine. I'm quite sure they didn't. And I don't know that they were not very educated people. Not that that necessarily matters, but like many poorly educated people in the United States in the 40s and 50s, they drink cocktails, right?
And so you end up, you do what millions and millions of Americans do, going through college and so on, waiting tables and being in the on-service world. And is that where, I mean, basically my understanding of the American legal system is you're not really supposed to do much with alcohol until 21. My impression is that you may have slightly jumped that gun, but tell me, how did you get into wine?
You know, I've often wondered myself, why wine, right? Why wine and why me? I had absolutely no historic or traditional basis to sort of fall in love with wine. But I can only say, Robert and Polly, that over time I felt that wine chose me. I didn't choose it, in a sense. You hear people say that, you know, why be a sculptor? Why be a lawyer? People feel like it was just chosen for them somehow. And for me, I started drinking wine at the age of 15 while I did my homework. So I was way under 21. And surprisingly, I wasn't ever what we call carded in the United States. I never had to show my ID. I guess I looked old enough. And I think it might have been helpful to my homework. I mean, I graduated first in my class, so it wasn't detrimental to my homework.
Can I come back on this? Because without getting into ages, we're going back a few years. What were you drinking? What would that wine have been?
Oh, I was drinking. This is very important because in the States then, you know, you could buy in certain states wine in supermarkets, and then I would buy whatever was on the bottom shelf, you know, which was largely Liebfraumilch or those terrible California Chablis and things like that.
It wasn't Thunderbird. It wasn't
no,
those.
I was too feminine for Thunderbird. Liebfraumilch was better for me. But if I ever went into a wine stores in those days were so off-putting. They were dark, they were wood paneled, there were men there. I never actually went into the whole wine store. I would buy what was in the sale bin, which was usually near the cash register. And as I recall, those were like 79-cent Bulgarian reds. So I certainly wasn't starting out with La Tâche.
And this was Boston.
Yes, Boston.
And so you've been introduced to wine. And the other thing is, there you are at 15, 16, drinking wine with you doing your homework. Who else was, were you a solitary drinker, or did you have 16-year-old fellow wine drinking people, and what happened to them, if you did?
Yeah, no, I was already living on my own. I ran away from home at a young age, and so I was on my own. I was working, and I was a good kid. I worked hard. I worked before school, after school, and 2 jobs on the weekends. So no one was there to say, don't do that. And actually, I didn't have any friends who drank wine too. You know, as many teenagers and college people do, there were other ways. If you really wanted to get drunk, there were faster, cheaper ways than wine, right? But that isn't why I drank wine. I just loved the whole idea of it. And I don't know where that came from, except that it has always seemed to me that wine is a way in which we take nature into our bodies every single day. I certainly drink wine every day, and I feel like there's some hard to describe primordial attachment to this idea. It's as essential to me as eating.
And was there I love this stuff, but was there I mean, there you are, 15, 16, 17 years old. Was there a sophistication element to it? Was there, I mean, you mentioned Lee from it. Was there a European attraction to it?
A little bit. I mean, I certainly felt very sophisticated at 16, reading, you know, I don't know, or one of the Bronte sisters, any of their novels, and sitting there with myself drinking a glass of wine made me feel quite grown up. And certainly if you were reading To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf and you were drinking your glass of wine, I mean, that really, you know, that was pretty special. Of course, no one noticed except for me. I was the only one who knew I was drinking wine.
And in all this reading of Virginia Woolf and the Brontes and so on, was there any wine, because a number of wine books in those days, there weren't that many. I grew up on Hugh Johnson's first book that was published in the 70s, but there weren't very many. At what point did your wine education begin? Yes.
Well, you know, I was, as I said, I was working a lot to get through high school and then to get through college. But I started trying to become a writer at the age of 19. I was still in college at that time. And I collected 324 rejection slips before my first article was sold. And that article was on butter. And I immediately realized, oh my God, okay, my future is in food writing. And I began to try really hard to be a food writer. And P.S., 5 or so years later, I was a pretty well-published food writer, including for the New York Times and other well-known publications. But I realized in that moment that what I really loved was not sort of how to make the risotto or not recipes, but what I really loved was the whole world of gastronomy. And that included, of course, beverages. And so I began to try and study the 4 great beverages of the world, which are tea, coffee, beer, and wine. And tea, coffee, and beer were pretty straightforward. I could research those, I could learn about them. Wine was really hard because even though I was drinking wine, as I mentioned, I was largely Liebfraumilch or Bulgarian reds. I was a writer, a freelance writer. I had no money. So, and wine, you know, you had to taste it. You had to taste great wine to really, even though I too read Hugh Johnson, you know, there were 2 things that were happening. One is that all of the great wine books at that time were British wine books. And the British, God love you guys, but you assume a certain familiarity with European geography, that no American had. I can remember so accurately feeling like, Macon, Merceau, where are these places, right? And I couldn't figure out what was inside of what. So there was that. The British books, even though I was reading them faithfully, they weren't helping a lot, and they were very dry. Sorry, it's a British thing. But, and at the same time, I couldn't figure out how to taste. So taste wine. So this was the last part of this story. All of the wine world, I had moved to New York already by this time, and the wine world was controlled by 5 men. And they were terrific guys, and they knew a lot. And one of those guys was a friend of mine. And every week they tasted great wine. I mean, the Chianti Classico producers would fly in, the port producers would fly in and do tastings just for these 5 men. So one of my friend went to the other guys and said, hey, she's pretty, she's harmless and she really needs to taste some wine. And would it be okay if she tasted with us? So they considered, and here was the deal they presented to me. I could taste with them as long as I didn't talk. And I took the deal. And for 8 years, every week I tasted with those men and I never said a word.
And did you learn from what, did they discuss it, you remaining quiet in the background, and were you disagreeing with them quietly thinking, I don't, that's not what I think?
No, I was so new. My eyes were wide open. I loved it. I mean, they had brilliant palates. I was a sponge. I was in no position to contradict them or think, or even think that I had an opinion. I didn't think I had a valid opinion yet. By the end of 8 years, I was starting to feel like, I'm kind of picking up on this now. I get a little bit of it anyway. And also because I was not only tasting the wines they were tasting, I was also adopting their professionalism. And that was very important to me. They really focused on what they tasted. They were thoughtful. So that level of professionalism, I'm super grateful for. And also because, European producers were flying in to taste wines with these men. So I was meeting people I would never have met before. I was Piero Antinori, Baron Philippe de Rothschild. I mean, it was unbelievable for me.
Even though you couldn't say hello to them properly because, well, possibly you were able to do that. Yeah.
But so all these years later, I think about young women in the wine business, and I think, first of all, when young women say they aren't feminists, I want to, I don't know, strangle them. I think you have no idea what went before and how hard it was to be a woman in the wine business in the early days. Number one, but number two is sometimes what you think is going to be a fight really is a blessing in disguise. And learn how to, out of those tastings, I remember all the things I didn't understand as I was tasting. And so that became, in many ways, the basis for the Wine Bible. A book that sold more than any of those men's books ever sold.
Now, there's a throwaway line in the middle of that I had to pick up on, because you wanted to be a writer originally, not necessarily writing about wine. And if you got accepted by the New York Times, which is on every would-be writer's list, there's the New Yorker, there's the New York Times, there's not very many other publications like that. You obviously were doing something right in the way that you were putting words together. In those days, that obviously started with food. And how did this actually move into writing about wine and towards the Wine Bible?
I think, well, I've never taken a writing course, and I don't have a degree in journalism. But I love good writing, and I really have worked hard to try and be a good writer. I would say I work as hard at trying to be a good writer as I do at trying to be a good taster and understander of wine. But I realized when I finally got the courage to write about wine instead of food, or at least in addition to food, that I had this unbelievable advantage. I had an American voice, I had a young voice, I had a young woman's voice, and I now knew a lot of editors in New York because of my food writing. So actually in 1 year, I went from writing 100% about food to 100% about wine. And I also painfully remembered how hard wine was for me to learn about it, begin to learn about it. And so I wrote about it in a way that made it easier, I think, for people to not have to have had my experience. And that was an asset too, because there were no wine books like that in those days. Wine books were a little bit elitist when the Wine Bible first came out.
Polly.
Karen, I have so many questions because I'm loving this version of the story that you're telling. We do this night on night, and a lot of what we hear are people who've come from the wine industry, from multi-generational families. This was just normal for them. And even that elitism is natural to them. And yet we live in a wine world that today is saying things like, women drink rosé and the millennials are killing wine. And if you're not educated, you'll never appreciate wine. And I would love to hear how you feel about the way that wine is talking to the modern day version of the Karen MacNeils who, you love it, you have an interest, you don't know about it, and you want to find a way, you want to have a voice.
Yeah, I think there are a lot of opportunities today to learn about wine. Think about classes. When I started, there was no WSET, at least there wasn't in the States. I'd never heard of it. There were no master sommeliers. There was no master of wine program. Those programs did exist, but they were quite confined to sort of an inner circle in London. It was, even as a journalist, I'd never even heard of those. And retail stores didn't give classes in those days. There were no wine classes in the United States. Even Kevin Zraly started, who's my dear friend, and who I used to be the substitute teacher for. Hard to follow Kevin Zraly, by the way. He's such a great teacher.
I know Kevin.
Yeah. But in any case, he didn't start until I believe the 80s. So I feel like for millennials and people who want to learn today, there's zillions of ways to learn about wine today that didn't exist before. And I just trust, I guess, maybe this is naive, but I trust that people will find their way to wine, that they'll come to it, that it is inherently compelling. And it's inherently compelling at an age when, we're seeing this now, right? People having to be separated and the whole fabric of enjoying wine together being a little bit torn apart, at least temporarily. I think that feels bad to people. And I think people, who knows about millennials, but I think they'll find their way. There's no reason not to believe. For 8,000 years, people have found their way to wine no matter what, because it is so gravitational. It is much more gravitational than any other beverage in the world. You never fall out of love with wine, for example. You might stop drinking coffee, you might stop drinking soft drinks, but nobody just sort of says, you know what, I'm bored with wine, I'm moving on.
So you do a lot of work with marketing and communications where you work with wineries and with other brands that intersect with wine. How do you feel that the notion of customer centricity is reflected in or a part of the voice of clients? Because I know that from working with wineries directly, it can be very difficult for them to get outside of their own heads and actually speak to perhaps that person that you were years back who had a passion, had a love affair, but didn't feel like they were reflected in it. What are the brands doing?
I don't think I don't think that's the job of the winery. The job of the winery is to be maniacally focused on their wine and their piece of ground, and to protect those and do the best they can. I think the job of inspiring people, teaching people, telling the stories of wineries, that's our job. And if that isn't happening well enough in the world, that's because we need to do a better job, and we need more people like us doing that job. But I don't think that's the job of wineries. If someone is maniacally focused on their wine and their farming their piece of ground well, I'm happy for that. They shouldn't have to think about millennials. You can think about millennials. I can think about millennials and what we should be doing. But that's the job of communicators.
I love that word gravitational. I'm going to hold on to that. I'm going to come back to the thought that you're talking about in terms of everybody finds their way into the bit of wine they want. There is an argument that it's quite siloed now. There are the natural wine people. There are the old world people. There are the, I only drink big California reds or whatever. And we were talking before we opened up that you're based in Santa Lena, not far from the Orrin Swift shop base museum, whatever you call it, which is full of these extraordinarily packaged wines that people outside California haven't always come across, but they're up to their $50, $100 for wines that don't necessarily say where they come from or the grapes they're made from, but they deliver a particular experience. But they're absolutely the opposite of what most wine writing historically has been about. And they're totally the opposite of, if you like, the sort of natural wines that we were talking to Alice Firing about, or indeed the orange wines we were talking about yesterday. How do you see that kind of, those kind of bubbles? They're almost political bubbles that really separate the wine world today.
Yeah, it's an interesting question because, sort of the whole mothership of traditional thinking about wine is the belief that wine is based on terroir, right? We have swallowed that idea very strongly. I certainly believe that. And yet, here you have, if you take the Orrin Swift wines, terroir is not an issue here. You don't have to have a belief system in that. It's like, it's as if we were all part of the same religion, and then there was this splinter group that ran around the edge here that didn't have the central belief in God, or the God of terroir. It's just another way to, I suppose, explore the idea of pleasure. But it's a less academic way. It's perhaps a more hedonistic way. And great. I mean, as you mentioned, the Orrin Swift store is right below my office here, and it's packed all the time. I'm always happy to see that. Maybe I should go in there and hold up a microphone and say, who can define the word terroir in here? Maybe, I don't know. I just think it's, certain wineries in Australia have this idea too. I was once talking to Brian Walsh, who was then the CEO of Yalumba.
Yeah.
And he said, wine isn't made in the vineyard, wine is made in the brain. And I thought, ooh, that's a pretty big statement, right? He said, no, we envision the kind of wine we think is going to give people pleasure. And we don't care what piece of ground it comes from. It just has to fit our mental concept of what we think people would love. And on the one hand, it's a little bit heresy, but on the other hand, I don't know, why not?
And then that's also an interesting, one of the things that's come up in a number of the conversations we've had, and yesterday we had Liz Gabay, Master of Wine, who's written a book about rosé, and earlier on we were talking about, when we did talk about natural wines, this question about typicity. Now, obviously, you write a book like the Wine Bible. I've written various books and so on, and I talk about the way I expect X or Y wine to look and taste. And there is this trend now, including amongst masters of wine, who you might have thought might look at it differently, saying, I don't see why Provence rosé should all be the same color. Why shouldn't it be as pale as this or a bit darker? And I don't see, and in a sense, there's almost a counterculture within the culture of people saying, no, the church should be a lot broader. But that, in terms of the character in Uncorked, who's learning to be a sommelier and who's supposed to be able to recognize what this wine is from the look and smell and so on, that kind of goes against what the whole sommelier training regime is about.
Yeah, I think it's you only get to the point though of saying accurately what is not classic once you understand what is classic. And to me, as a journalist or a communicator, knowing what historically represents typicity is important. It is important so that you can feel comfortable about it. It's like understanding a certain time in literature or a certain era. And then you can, or in art maybe, and then when someone decides to go in a completely opposite direction and be super creative, you can realize the beauty in that as well, because you understand how much it does vary from typicity. But I think that's I don't think anyone would even understand radical creativity until they understood just how what the beauty is in what went before that was indeed classic. Maybe
so
it's
you
just
need to know how. So you need to know how to draw before you become an abstract or an impressionist.
Yeah,
in a sense.
exactly.
I like that. We have a lady called Amber Lebeau, who's an American based in Paris, who is a very good blogger with a lot of tech expertise as well. Amber, I don't think your camera's on. I'm just going to unmute you. You had a question for Karen.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I was just wondering, mentioned the Uncorked movie. I love the Wine Bible, and it was so great to see it so prominently featured there. Did you work with the producers of the film or have any idea that your book was going to kind of take center stage?
Definitely not. I wished I had known. I mean, just one day I was sitting in my office after the film came out, and a friend called and said, have you seen this film? And I said, no. And she said, you should watch it tonight. The Wine Bible is in it not all over the place, but it's very prominently in the film. So it was a big surprise to me, and I was quite grateful. I mean, it was, although, it's funny when you see at least sommeliers in the United States, one of the things that makes me so happy is you see, if you ask them to open the trunk of their car, here's a beat up copy of the Wine Bible, underlined, tabbed, dog-eared pages. I didn't set out to write a book for sommeliers to study, but it turns out that it has worked as a good study tool, apparently.
And in terms of the 3 editions, moving into the next edition, I mean, there are all the sort of things like, Georgia, Israel, all sorts of places that were not really playing in the early days, and indeed places like Priorat or indeed Sicily and Puglia and all sorts of places whose quality has changed and emerged. What's excited you most over the time in terms of what's evolved?
Well, my most exciting recent trip before we all sort of had to stop traveling was last fall, before the pandemic began, I think, to the Himalayas to see Ao Yun in the Tibetan not the Tibetan Autonomous Region, but the Tibetan Cultural Region that brings it. So about 12,000 feet up in the Himalayas, here is a winery that is owned by LVMH, Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy. And I certainly never thought that in my lifetime, it would be even remotely possible to make a fine wine in a place like the Himalayas. It's that the truth is that the whole wine world has become enormously exciting, both the new places and especially the new old places, like what you're suggesting, Robert, sort of, going, discovering anew Georgia or Croatia or Israel. It's so phenomenally exciting because there's an element of what's happening now and what's new, but also what went before thousands of years ago. How much more, intellectually turned on could any given subject matter get? It's just great.
But let's talk about, so we've got this book, which is a big old-fashioned thing with words on paper, but you've been doing a lot of this kind of thing. Can we talk a little bit about how you've evolved into being a different kind of communicator, or a communicator in other media, if you like?
Yeah, what I think my when I began, when I lived in my 5th floor walk up in Spanish Harlem in New York, and was on food stamps when I first moved to New York, I had a very conscious plan back then. This was when I was in my 20s, to understand all different forms of communication, to not only be good at writing articles and newspaper articles, but eventually to write a book, to do radio, to do television, even to write advertising, just to really try and understand the whole circle of how good communication works. And I also did something that I don't even know why, but I'm so grateful I did, which was I would go as a young woman and watch people who were great in a given area, watch them speak about the area they were great in. It could be something that I knew nothing about, silverware, I don't know, cars, but I began to see that there were certain elements of good communication and good visual communication. And, as everyone out there who's listening, who is a writer knows, it's pretty hard to make a living just from writing alone. And I was ambitious. I mean, I was as hard a worker at writing as I am a hard worker at writing. It's still hard. It's actually harder today to make a living doing that than it was 30 years ago. So I began, like many communicators, to go from writing exclusively to writing and teaching, to writing and teaching and presenting, to writing, presenting, teaching, presenting, radio, television. It just, it took a while to do. But once you understand, I think, some of the bases of good communication, then why not explore that whole world? It's easy to sit home and be just behind the pen. It takes some courage to get yourself out there. But if you can, it's a good thing to do.
So let's just talk about that, because there's been a lot of discussion. In fact, Amber, whom we saw earlier, kicked off a lot of online discussion about how bad virtual tastings, online tastings so often are. What did you, watching these people talking about silverware or whatever the subject was, what was the key takeaway that you would say to somebody, if you're meeting a millennial who wants to do this stuff? There's no quick way to learn anything, but what would be the words of advice you would give them that really you picked up from those experiences?
Be vulnerable.
Hmm.
People, a lot of people who do wine, live virtual wine tastings feel that they need to be the expert, they need to show off, they need to be, the higher authority. But in fact, what is the most wonderful thing about communication, good communication, is the courage to be vulnerable. Because then the audience knows that they're with you, because we are all vulnerable in some kind of way. When you put on a facade of great expertise, it sets up a barrier between you and your audience, even if you have great expertise. I mean, think about someone like Aubert de Bellin. I don't know, of the Domaine del Romani Conti. He's a good example. Yeah. He has as much right to showing off as anyone, and yet he never does. He's very vulnerable when he talks to you. And I didn't learn that from him, but the first time I heard him speak, I thought, that's it right there. It's the willingness to be that way.
Erin, if you don't mind me asking, how is that at odds with current popular soundbite communication that we see on social media, where the purpose is to establish in 1 minute and 15 seconds our expertise?
Yeah, it does make it hard, doesn't it? You're right, because sound bites don't lend themselves to this. Although, you know who's really good at this is Jancis. She too has the right to be, she's as expert a person in wine as anyone in the entire world. But she's very careful to always, even on Twitter, say, I don't know, seems like this to me, or she's very open. She is not, she doesn't position herself as the ending authority. So I think the fact that we have to communicate in smaller spaces means we have to be even more careful about coming off as the real people that we are, as opposed to a kind of blustery, distant expert. It's funny for me, this
I think it's interesting because all the wine is so subjective.
This can really work, by the way.
And there's a note.
Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
No, finish what you're saying, please.
Well, sometimes I give in my office here, I have 2.5 employees other than me, and about 8 people who are who do research and assorted special work on various projects. And one of the areas of income for us, a big area of income for us, is not writing, is giving presentations to large corporations and big law firms, international law firms, or big companies, successful corporations. Those presentations can be for anywhere from 10 to 500 people. And in general, at least historically, most of the people have been in the audience have been men. And so it can be almost wonderfully disarming when you stand up in front of 100 men who are ready. You can feel it, right? There are at least 5 guys in there who are ready to eat you alive, and they're gonna start talking to you about old vintages of Vegas Ophelia. You really have to know your stuff. But if you do, and you have the strength to be vulnerable, people get very quiet very quickly, and they listen, and then they have fun, and then they share and they drink together, and it's good. It's a hard thing to learn to do, but you have to know your stuff before you can be vulnerable, I think. But if you can, for anyone who certainly wants to go into presentations in front of groups. It's a very important skill to develop, and true to your heart. It is the way we are.
I'm going to come back to the online tastings because, I mean, two things. One is that Amber runs something called virtual wine events, where she's actually been logging a database of what is happening in terms of virtual tastings and which ones are worth following up on and doing. And she's actually just noted here that amongst the ones that are being most bookmarked are your Taste with Karen Oakville series. What is that? I mean, how long have you been doing it? Because for most people, virtual wine tastings really began 1 hour after we all got locked down. But you've been doing it for longer than that. So talk us through that.
Well, you know, I realized when we all had to shelter in place, well, actually, even before that, as of February, you know, probably like the both of you, I was looking at my calendar and seeing event after event after event being canceled. Not just events I was going to, but events I was speaking at and going to be paid for. And as an employer, I began to think, oh my God, how am I going to keep my employees employed? And so, yes, we jumped on live virtual tastings, really among the fastest in the United States. And I guess what I realized is, even though quite quickly a number of Napa Valley producers did do that too, it's hard for winemakers who are not used to being on camera to talk on camera. And that's perhaps what Amber is referring to. It's much better, really, to be interviewed. And so we went to the Oakville wine growers and said, you know, this is one of the most prestigious appellations within the Napa Valley. The neighborhood is just unbelievable, right? It's Harlan, Dalla Valle, Screaming Eagle, Farniente. I mean, names at Gargiulo, names that everyone would recognize. Opus One. And I know those producers really well and said, I'm sure you could go on by yourself. Of course you could. But if you tell your story to me and let me ask you questions, maybe it would work better. And I think they all said, oh, it would feel better to tell our story to someone as opposed to get up and all of a sudden try to be good at what is effectively like television. So yes, we have a 7-part series with Oakville, and we do 3 winemakers each time. And we don't get into the technicalities of how the wine is made, but we talk a lot about philosophy and flavor and pleasure, and why the wines are the way they are, and what the ground is like. And you know, the Oakville wine growers organize themselves very well. So people can buy the wines ahead if they like, or they can just be inspired and buy them afterwards. But it's been great. We're doing session 5 actually tomorrow.
And what follows Oakville? Are you going to work up and down the valley in Napa because it's an easy drive for you, or are you going to go to other regions and do the same thing?
Oh no, we've been doing a lot. We have sessions lined up with vintners in Italy. We're doing something with Marilisa Allegrini in a couple of weeks here. We did a terrific session with Laura Catena, who is one bundle of energy anyway. So it's pretty easy to be successful with Laura Catena. She's just a force herself. So yeah, we've been talking to vintners really around the world, not just in Napa, and it's been fantastic. I've learned an enormous amount myself.
And Karen,
we've had Laura. Sorry, go ahead, Polly.
Yeah, we've had we've had these people on, and I agree with you. We don't have to work because they can just talk and tell those stories, and they themselves are great communicators about their own brands, which Andrew mentioned that so many in the chat, that so many winemakers are themselves quite humble about what they do. And it is, and then from our position as marketers, it's difficult to draw them out and get them to actually share their wins and share their stories and make it compelling. My question is, as you're doing this, so you are now in a visual and a virtual medium, are you planning and talking to that the new 17-year-old woman, the new 22-year-old woman who is passionate about wine? You know, how much does that background influence the way that you conduct your interviews today?
Yes, it does, because whenever I either speak or write, I imagine this person. And I'm imagining telling the story of this wine to this imaginary person. And I've had this, she happens to be a woman, she happens to be smart, but she knows nothing about wine. And I've had this person in my mind from the very beginning. And so I always try to either talk about wine or ask questions in a way that this person would find fascinating. So as we all know, I mean, part of being good at, or trying to get good at communication, is to be able to talk about wine so that the most knowledgeable person listening and the least knowledgeable person listening are both fascinated. That's the goal. And so I'm very conscious of that, of only choosing questions that I think the most knowledgeable person and the least knowledgeable person would find interesting.
But you mentioned earlier that you feel like it's your role as the wine journalist to tell those stories, and not so much the role of the winery or the winemakers themselves. How does that intersect with the economics of wine production and wine selling? Because not every winery can have a Karen on their side standing up telling their stories for them. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose for winemakers, even though, as I was saying, I don't think it's their main goal to have to be their own best marketing agent. I suppose that just being yourself and being good at what you do, and being willing to be vulnerable again about it, is a form of marketing. And so we see, you know, I can think of a number of people in California and also in Italy and in France who may not have degrees in marketing or communications, and they don't have money to hire an important ambassador, let's say. But just by being themselves are so compelling, I guess. So,
and what about this, just to touch on what you're talking about, which is the idea of the persona. You have a persona, and I am very open about the fact that I have one too, and I have her picture on my wall, and for years it's been Uma Thurman, that every time when I write in my own voice, I think to myself, I'm writing to someone like Uma Thurman because that meshes really well with it. It's not something that wineries tend to do because it veers into the too market driven side of it, that we are producing something for an audience. So there seems to be a mildly confrontational space in there where we're saying, as writers and communicators, we need to know exactly who we're talking to. How does that play into the wineries needing to know exactly who they are producing and selling to?
Yeah, I don't think a lot of wineries completely know who they are talking to and selling to. They can certainly know who they're selling to, right? And they certainly have a brand and an image, perhaps, of their ideal consumer, if only because their wine costs X amount, and so you have to be perhaps in a certain group to be able to afford it. But you know, living in California, it's very interesting because San Francisco and Silicon Valley are not far away. They're a 2-hour drive away. And the general uniform of someone in Silicon Valley is a black t-shirt and a pair of jeans. And that person can be 29 and have millions of dollars. And so I think wineries, especially in Napa and Sonoma, have grown to imagine their audience. They've been trained to realize their audience is probably bigger than they think, and that they can't have just an image of, I don't know, a wealthy doctor in Westchester in New York as their ideal customer. Because the guy who walks in flip-flops and a black t-shirt could very well be one of their major buyers.
I grew up in Cupertino, so I agree with that entirely. Thank you.
Yeah.
Going full circle back to where you started, Karen, reading the British wine writers and seeing a different culture. Coming on to now, I certainly, when I'm in California, and indeed when I'm looking at wine and talking in New York wine stores or whatever, I'm very aware of people looking at wine differently in the US. I mean, the 100-point scale has gone around the world, but it's never been as strong anywhere as it has been in the US. The idea of what's hot and what's not, the latest star, all those sort of things. How aware are you in terms of what you do? And certainly, you know, you go on panels with Jancis and with other people, and so essentially Europeans, Brits, Americans. How aware are you of those differences today? Have we come together, or are we still very different?
Between the Brits and US,
Brits and indeed Europeans. We were talking about the Italians and other Europeans. Do you think there is a difference between the way wine is perceived in the US and wine is perceived elsewhere?
I think there is. There is still a difference, but it's not as pronounced. It's a little bit like the old distinction, old world wines and new world wines. And we realized that an old world wine could be made in Sonoma, just as a new world wine could be made in Bordeaux. That those two, that the fabric of those two has begun to weave together. I like to think that we Americans have learned a lot from how the Europeans and how the British think about wine, how they respect it, how disciplined they are when they taste it and explore it and learn about it. And I like to think that the Brits and Europeans have taken a little bit of, I don't know, American enthusiasm and woven that into the way they think about wine. Not just American, but also Australian. It's hard not to fall in love with wine when you have an Australian in the room with you, right? The Australians are, I don't know, they're genetically happy. And so I do think Americans have had a positive force. We're also not afraid, we're less afraid perhaps of embarrassment and less afraid to ask the simple question. And sometimes, you know, a simple question can be a pretty profound question. So I think the two worlds are moving together. I used to, for example, when I was a young journalist, I would be terrified if I had to go into a room with British wine writers. Robert, I would have hid in the corner if I knew you were in the room. I was terrified. And,
far from it.
And now I don't know. Now it's, it's much better integrated between the two worlds.
I'd like to say thank you very, very much. I think it's a very nice point on which to end, given where this story started. And I love the fact that when Polly and I started this little conceit, or whatever it is, at the beginning, just around the time that you started your sessions, we decided not to call it sort of the wine thing or whatever. It was going to be about the business of wine from the beginning. And I love the fact that you have embraced both sides of this picture. The fact that communicating about wine to the person that you were back discovering wine in Boston, but also actually commercially helping wine businesses and wine people do that kind of communication in a broader sense. And I love that holistic approach, because, as I said, it's the way Polly and I see it. So thank you very much for your time today, and good luck with the rest of your series. This one will be on YouTube within 48 hours. We're up to nearly 1,200 subscribers on YouTube, which is quite nice without me pushing.
Thank you.
It's growing day by day. And we've got some other really fun ones coming up, and relevant to what we're talking about today in a way, is on Friday, we're looking at wine influencers. And we have one of the top Chinese influencers, Terry Xu. And then we've got someone you may have come across in Napa, Paul Mabray, who's an expert on marketing wine, including and excluding to the influencers, and Fabian Lene, who's got some controversial thoughts on whether some of those influencers we see don't have as much influence as they pretend sometimes claim. So come back and watch that. If you've been watching tonight, come back and watch the videos, and subscribe to be kept in the loop, and subscribe and follow, please follow Karen's tastings. As Amber has said, they are amongst the most popular events online. So please follow those. And thank you again, Karen. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe.
My pleasure.